new or the audience changes. And in this case, since I know you all are rose experts, I did tweak it a little bit to point out the areas in it where roses are available in the 19th century in Natchez, and you all may, since you're an antique rose society, you probably already know about all the places that roses were available, but I'm going to throw these out at you too. So this is really the story of the heritage of gardening and Camellia horticulture in Natchez, and particularly of my family's Camellia legacy. Now, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Are they fine? First of all, let me tell you that I'm going to show you quite a few newspaper articles that you will not have time to read. I'll tell you why they're important and try to point out the things in them. So, on this first one, which is dated 1836 and 37, camellias had been introduced in the United States actually soon after the Revolution, and Natchez has a long history of embracing the latest horticultural fashions. As early as 1836, camellias and other exotic plants were arriving on ships from New York from the, quote, well-known establishment of William Prince and Sons. Now, you may be familiar with Prince's Nursery, which was established in the 1730s on Long Island in New York and was patronized by Jefferson, Adams, and Washington. Prince's 1846 manual on the right there was the premier authority on roses in the 19th century. I'm sure you have that in your garden library. In 1840, a, quote, splendid assortment of camellias arrived direct from France. In fact, just in case you were an amateur who didn't know what camellias looked like, you could go to the store on Main Street to see a drawing of the plant in bloom. As early as 1842, a description of Natchez gardens included some noble specimens of camellias at Dr. Mercer's house at Laurel Hill outside Natchez. The original house shown here burned in 1967, but Louisa Russell Connor wrote about Laurel Hill in her memoirs in 1905. And she said, "In the back garden are the largest japonica trees I've ever seen. They say the girth of one is 30 inches. And those same camellia bushes are still there today. In fact, in 1843, one could even order camellias from James Orr's newly established nursery in Louisville, Kentucky, which would be sent on steamboats free of expense. Notice that he also offered a good collection of German houseplants, whatever that might be, maybe you all know that, as well as China ever-blooming and tea-scented roses. You could hire a gardener who could be found at Mrs. Postlethwaite's, or possibly even a man from England. Mr. Adam Clifford would lay out your pleasure grounds for 20 cents an hour. If you couldn't find anything at the nurseries, you could peruse the local auctions for those rare and valuable flowers you wanted, or even flowers from those same celebrated gardens of the princes on Long Island. Now, the Stockmans who had these auction houses are the uncles of my great-great-grandmother, Mary Rowan Balsufer, and she may have visited them to find flowers for her garden. Apparently, many flowers, including camellias and roses, quote, of all kinds, came directly from France. Gardening advice was available first in almanacs, including the Gardener's Calendar developed by Isaac Gilliard, the brother of my fourth great-grandfather. And if you weren't sure about your gardening prowess, at the local stores, you could purchase such edifying manuals as the Florist Manual, Downing's Fruits and Fruit Trees of America, or even Robert Buist on the Culture of the Rose. And you have this one in your library. I thought this was very interesting because up at the top, the autograph says to C.M. Hovey, Esquire, from the author. And if you're a Camellia person, you may know that there's a Camellia named for Mr. Hovey also. Natchez gardeners were fortunate to have Thomas Affleck and his southern nurseries in nearby Washington. Affleck had an extensive stock of fruit and ornamental trees on 45 acres there. He offered a variety of trees, shrubs, and plants. Unfortunately, I've never found a Camellia or Japonica, as they're often called in the 19th century in his advertisements. He did, however, offer, as you can see here with where the arrow is, a fine collection of the rarest new roses. And his Southern Rural Almanac was sure to be helpful for your kitchen and flower garden. And if your garden wasn't flourishing, you could always order some unadulterated Peruvian guano from Mr. Affleck. Well, I had to look that up. And to put it politely, guano is the accumulated excrement of seabirds, bats, and seals. And it's on these islands, and it was Peru's major industry in the 19th century. And you can still buy it today on Amazon. That's what that black bucket is on the right. All of this leads to the story of how our yard at my family's home, Greenleaves in Natchez, became full of magnificent camellia bushes in the back and in the front yard. The large bushes behind the blooming azaleas are all camellias. This landscape has been a beneficiary of the long history of horticulture in Natchez and has developed over 173 years. My great-great-grandparents, George Washington Kuntz and Mary Rowan Beltzuber, married in 1845. In Natchez, there were already numerous nurseries, and by 1839, a branch of a New Orleans establishment had been opened by Thomas Pringle, offering not only a few fine double-flowering Camellia japonicas, but also a few fine Dutch canary birds. In Natchez, there was even a manufacturer of flower pots by, quote, a Mr. Esther Fixer or some other crooked name. It was deemed superior to imported ware and a benefit to the whole state. If they ran out of nurseries to visit in Natchez, they could just wait for the shrubbery boat to arrive from Vicksburg. This is my favorite thing. Notice the many varieties of roses which were available on board the boat. Bengal, daily or Chinese, ever-blooming, tea-scented, noisettes, bourbons, perpetuals, microphyllus, climbing or pillar, hybrid Chinese, mosses. Now this next word, it looks like Provence, but I wonder if this is supposed to be Provence or cabbage, striped and garden varieties. Don't you wish they still had that shrubbery boat? By 1847, they could see in downtown Natchez camellias that were being imported from France via New Orleans by Monsieur Puissant, who advertised that he had been a gardener to Versailles. You might be particularly interested in his frothy roses, and maybe you know what that is. Also, notice right under that he carried onions of flowers, which is actually an old word for bulbs. So the Kuntzes were seeing camellias and landscapes in Natchez when in 1849 they moved to the house on South Rankin Street that became the Kuntz House, which we now call Greenleaf's. So in this picture, I want you to notice that live oak tree because it's still standing and it's huge today. In this side view, the Kuntz house is on the left looking down Washington Street, and we can see the carriage entrance and the high fences which everyone had installed to keep their animals in and other people's animals out. In 1849, when they moved to their new house, Mr. Francis Kendall Ketteringham had opened his flower and seed establishment at the forks of the road and had for sale cheap camellias as well as other shrubs, seeds, and roses. You may know that the Forks of the Road was one of the South's largest slave markets, and current research suggests that it may have actually been a mart, like the French market in New Orleans, with many different stalls for a variety of goods. And the National Park Service has plans to make that site a major part of the Natchez National Historical Park. They were seeing advertisements by gardeners such as Samuel Richardson, who even included his references for some regionally significant gardens he had designed, including Rosetown and Barrow's Estate, which you know as Afton Villa. By 1850, camellias were arriving readily on steamboats and were available for sale. Obviously, Mr. Ketteringham was doing well because in 1852, in addition to camellias and roses, he advertised implements, flower pots, books, and seeds. His business continued until shortly after his death in 1853. He was particularly proud of offering Landris seeds, which you may have heard of, because David Landris Nurseries had provided plants for the founding fathers, Washington and Jefferson. So, when in 1855, Mary Rowan Kuntz planted an Albaplena camellia in the front yard of her new home on Rankin Street, she had a choice of camellias from several establishments in Natchez. And here is that magnificent bush in a photograph from the early 20th century. The inscription on the back of that recently discovered photograph says, "This was always here." Unfortunately, it no longer exists. It died the winter of 1990, which is actually still makes it pretty old when it died. Shortly after that Albaplena was planted, during the Civil War, the magnificent house Clifton, seen in this detail from Audubon's 1823 painting of Natchez, was destroyed by the occupying Union Army. And a later account tells us that splendid flowering camellias were laid low by the Vandal axes. In the newspapers of the day, they read about scented camellias produced in Italy, and in the last 3 days of 1886, the sale in Paris of $680,000 worth of flowers, which would be $19 million today, and 10,000 dozen camellias, that's 120,000. The Kuntz's youngest daughter, Virginia Lee, my great-grandmother, married Melker Beltsuber in 1891, and they became the next generation to make the Kuntz house their home. As we can see from this early photo, they did not appear to spend much time gardening. And in fact, their daughter Rowan could ride her horse, stabled in what is now the garage, around the grounds. They lived part of every year at their home, Rock Rowan, in Irvington, New York, which they built about 1905. So my grandfather, young Melker Beltzuver, born in 1892, had an adventurous young life, especially when, during his years at Princeton University, he managed to find time for racing his Duesenberg at White Plains, New York. About the same time, his mother's good friend, Ruth Audley Wheeler, was raising her daughter, Ruth Audley, my grandmother, just a few blocks up Washington Street. As you can see, little Ruth Audley wore flowers even at a young age, even though she doesn't seem too happy about it in the picture on the left. But as she grew older, it seemed to be the fashion to adorn yourself with camellias. Meanwhile, as young people, they observed camellias being used as decorations at parties around town, particularly at their own homes. But notice that at the Wheeler house, there were also garlands of roses. In 1917, young Melker and Ruth Audley, my grandparents, were married and began their married life at the Koontz house. It was Ruth Audley Beltzuver who coined the name Greenleaves in 1930 for the Koontz house. At a party for Lyle Saxon, who was writing his book, Old Louisiana, Saxon asked to see her garden. "Oh," she said, "it's only a garden of green leaves." He made such a beautiful speech about what could be lovelier than a garden of green leaves that she said, "Oh, Mr. Saxon, you have just named our house." Perhaps they even went to see Camille, the Lady of the Camellias, starring Rudolph Valentino, at the Baker Grand Theater in June of 1922. They began planting camellias that year with a pink perfection bought from Mr. Blythe and named for their daughter, Virginia Lee, when she was born in 1926. At this point, Ruth Audley Beltzuver is purchasing the plants. But the cards are written by her husband, Melker, who is shown here on the left with that same pink perfection, and on the right, little Virginia Lee in front of her pink perfection bush. And here's that little girl, Virginia Lee, in her pink perfection, still blooming prolifically 100 years later. In December 1928, Melker and Ruth Audley had a landscape plan developed by Paul Mueller, a landscape architect in Memphis, Tennessee. The swimming pool, which was built in 1926, is shown. It called for a fountain as the central axis of the back garden, as well as large specimen camellias. In this photo of the backyard, taken between 26 and 1930, the yard has only a few bushes, and the bird bath is visible on the left where the arrow is near the gallery. By 1930, Melker and Ruth Audley had 3 children, Melker Jr., my mother Ruth Audley, and Virginia Lee. From records, we do know that some of the camellias had been planted by then, but obviously they were still small cuttings or bushes. But here we can see the beginnings of the current garden structure, and now instead of a fountain, the bird bath has become the central axis of the backyard garden as suggested by the landscape architect. Ruth Audley Beltzuver continued to wear her beloved camellias as she did when she went to the garden club meeting at Hope Farm about 1932, where nearly all the ladies were wearing camellias. 1932, you may know, was the first Natchez spring pilgrimage, so it's obvious that camellias have been part of the advertising of pilgrimage since its inception. The whole family participated in pilgrimage festivities and promotions, and many of the early promotional photographs were taken in the gardens of the pilgrimage houses. This photograph was taken at Greenleaves in 1940 with my mother displaying her pilgrimage finery. But a short time later, during World War II, she wore Camellia when she was among the college girls entertaining the locally stationed officers at Stanton Hall. In fact, in 1939, even Vivian Lee got into the act when the Melrose camellias were sent to her after the filming of Gone with the Wind. So, how did Greenleaf's go from the relatively bare grounds of the 1930s, with the structure suggested by Mueller and beginning to be filled in by plantings, to the garden that it is today? The answer lies in my grandparents' attention to detail in their gardens. Among the books at Greenleaf's, I discovered gardening and Camellia books, many with notations by my grandfather about the cultivation of camellias, varieties in which they were interested or had already planted, and even the fertilization of camellias. My grandfather wrote notes on any spare sheet of paper, even upside down. And in 1931, in the fly leaves of his book, he also began to list his current varieties and develop plans for the yard, numbering and locating all the bushes. He had a complete 8-volume illustrated set of Luther Burbank's How Plants Are Trained to Work for Man, including this volume on specific methods of grafting and budding. He ordered fertilizer from the Reuter Seed Company in New Orleans in 1937. There's no evidence of Peruvian guano on this receipt, though. Nursery stock came from all over the South, including this order from Flowerwood Nursery in Mobile, which was started as a backyard hobby by Harry Smith in 1938 and today is a huge third-generation wholesale nursery. He also had a cold frame in the backyard, which you can see in this snapshot taken of his children in 1925. So the yard began to fill up with bushes, and my grandfather continued to keep meticulous records. In the days before computers and spreadsheets, this little wooden filing box kept by Melker Beltsufer served as the record of all the camellias planted at Greenleaf's. There's a map of the whole yard, which was then divided into 9 sections. Each section has a corresponding card on which each bush is numbered. And on the reverse of each section card, each numbered bush is named. So each section has a card on which the bushes are numbered and an accompanying card which names each bush. Section G, which is the hill in the backyard, originally had 50 bushes planted, but now there are only a handful. On the Section F cards, we can see that notes continued to be made when plants died or removed. There were over 200 bushes planted from 1922 until my grandfather's death in 1945. In addition, each variety has a card on which the location, source, original size, and usually cost are recorded. These are among the earliest bushes purchased in 1922 from Rosedown in St. Francisville. Remember that gardener Samuel Richardson from Rosedown? Maybe he had planted those original camellias. Neither plant, unfortunately, survives today. These 2 cards illustrate some of the many sources of the camellias, both locally and from all over the South. Meyer, Rosedown, Overlook, Ships, Magnolia Gardens. When I first started studying this, I had no idea where these nurseries were. Many of the plants have a story hidden within their acquisition and planting. This is the story of Sarah Frost on Washington Street. The card for this Sarah Frost, an old variety, is a family history wrapped in a camellia history. Before we hear this story, look at the bottom of this card and note the other Sarah Frost because it shows you how each bush was named. It tells you the size, an 8-inch cutting, where it came from, Overlook, the date it was planted, 12/10/36, how much it cost, 17.5 cents, and where it is in the yard. The original Sarah Frost bush was located at the townhouse of my great-great-great-grandparents Andrew and Milbury McCrary, which is now known as the Van Court Townhouse. When their daughter Eliza married Audley Clark Britton, they first continued to live at the McCrary house. They are my great-great-grandparents, and they purchased this house on Pearl Street in 1868. We called it the Britton House, but it's now called Magnolia Hall. Eliza Britton moved a big bush, quote, of the Sarah Frost Camellia variety from her parents' house a block away to her new house on Pearl Street, where the Britton's daughter, Ruth Audley, and her husband, William Anderson Scott Wheeler, my great-grandparents, also lived until Ruth Audley's death in 1926. And here she is in the heavily planted backyard. Maybe one of those bushes is that Sarah Frost Camellia. And here it is today. It's now 154 years old, and its trunk is 42 inches in circumference. In 1926, Bardell Wheeler planted a layer of that bush in the front yard at Greenleaves, her sister Ruth Audley's home, but it was soon moved to the backyard, where it has become gigantic today. The sad end of this story is that young Bardell died shortly after planting this bush during the last global pandemic of the Spanish influenza. A happier story is this bush, named for her, which was old when it was moved from Madison Street by the contractor Otley in 1926 and, quote, cost a plenty. It also won prizes at the 1945 Camellia Show. Today it has many different forms and colors on this one bush. The experts tell us it may actually be the variety Portuguese pink. My favorite story is about this bush, Kay Sawada, purchased in 1941 from Overlook Nursery, which was northwest of Mobile. There were 50 camellia bushes purchased from Overlook. In 1945, actually on January the 17th, 1945, my parents, Richard and Ruth Audley Connor, were married, and he was on leave from World War II. My mother carried camellias from that Kay Sawada bush. In January 1950, when my Aunt Virginia married, everyone carried Kay Sawada camellias. The little flower girls alone seem to have been carrying Pink Perfection camellias to match their pink dresses. Maybe you can pick me out of that picture there. And here is Virginia Lee Beltsuver Morrison in 2004 trimming the Kay Sawada bush, which provided her wedding flowers. So who was Kay Sawada? He immigrated from Japan in 1910 and raised and developed camellias at his Overlook Nursery northwest of Mobile. In 2006, we visited Overlook and met the owner at the time, George Sawada, his grandson. And so the grandchildren of Melker Beltsuver and Kay Sawada met 62 years after the Greenleaves Kay Sawada was purchased. There are 22 plants recorded as being grafted by ships who had a nursery in Brookhaven. Here's still a mystery. We don't know who Mr. Walker is, but we assume it was someone local. And Ruth Audley Beltsuver bought 8 camellias at the Garden Club sale at Memorial Park in 1933, which was also called Catherine Miller's Jungle Garden Sale. Catherine Miller was a driving force in the Pilgrimage Garden Club in the Natchez Spring Pilgrimage, and she must have had plants brought in from Jungle Gardens on Avery Island, Louisiana, where Ned McElhaney raised and sold camellias in his jungle gardens, and, as you may know, where his family still produces their famous Tabasco sauce. 10 plants were purchased from Robert Rubel, whose Longview Nursery was also near Overlook in Mobile. My Aunt Virginia told me she remembered often going to those nurseries in Mobile with her father. Magnolia Gardens near Charleston, South Carolina, imported some of the first camellias and introduced over 150 cultivars beginning in the 1840s to the United States. Melker Balsuver purchased 21 camellias from them. Mr. Brody is another mystery, but Fruitland Nursery was located in Augusta, Georgia, and you would recognize the grounds today as the Augusta National Golf Course, where the Masters Golf Tournament is played. Mr. Gerbing was also a mystery until I found this book in the Balsuver Library and realized that the location in Fernandina, Florida, matched this receipt in 1945 for a carton of plants from Gerbing Camellia Nursery in Fernandina, Florida, which you now know as Amelia Island. Gustav Gerbing wrote, "I have 250,000 camellias and azaleas occupying 15 acres of ground along the banks of the Amelia River." Sadly, there are now nothing but houses on those 15 acres, but you can still see some huge camellia bushes in their yards. T. Kiona had a nursery in Mobile, also near Overlook. In a 1939 article about him, Life magazine called him the largest camellia grower in the U.S. with 20 acres of camellia plants, who sold 150,000 plants a year. A few plants were purchased from Stokes near Alexandria. I happened to find this snapshot, which named him along with other familiar Natchez men. Samuel Stokes started the first nursery in 1901 near what is Forest Hill, Louisiana. It's now a third-generation nursery, one of 200 in the area. And last but not least were the plants purchased locally. Some from Chris Meyer, who established a nursery business in Natchez in 1902, which is still in business today. Some large plants were purchased from local yards. Unfortunately, this Benishite yard and house is now the site of a school, but notice that the plants were used on stage in the 1939 pilgrimage. You can see them here on either side of the stage. And then they brought them home and planted them on either side of the steps at Greenleaves. Here they are 83 years later. My grandparents' camellia plantings at Greenleaves were encouraged by the friendly competition of the garden club flower shows. You understand about that. And especially the competition between the men. One of my grandfather's fellow camellia aficionados was his good friend across the street at the Elms, Joe Kellogg's, shown here with his wife, Alma. Another camellia fanatic, his friend William Kendall at Montaigne, may have been inspired by the original camellias, including this one in the photograph, which were on the property when his family bought the house in 1935. And you can be sure his beautiful wife, Mary Louise, also an original garden club member, encouraged his plantings. Mr. Meyer of the local nursery family helped design and plant the camellia landscape at Montaigne. In this photograph from the 1930s, you can see the small camellia bushes recently planted. Now that area is a camellia forest, and there are 350 varieties of camellias on the grounds. My Aunt Virginia and Mary Louise Kendall Goodrich Shields, both now deceased, carried on the tradition of caring for the family camellias. Mary Louise lived to the astonishing age of 109, promoting her beloved camellias to the end of her life. So maybe being a flower fanatic is a good thing. This undated clipping, published before 1945, when my grandfather died, describes a camellia show at Stanton Hall which hosted over 800 visitors. Most of the prizes were won by those same three families, Kendall, Kellogg, and Beltsuber. One of the prizes went to an alpaplina from Greenleaves, possibly that alpaplina planted in 1855. I need to interrupt the Greenleaf story for a moment to show you our home, Ventura, in Natchez, which enters into the story here. At the Camellia show at Stanton Hall in 1954, only attended by 700 people, once again Greenleaves and William Kendall walked away with many of the prizes. And now, a Chandelier elegans, which is still blooming in my garden at Ventura, won first and second place in that category. And here it is today, still blooming away. Just recently, I found in a GCA bulletin a note written by Gladys Evans, who bought and restored Ventura in 1940. She wrote about the Kendalls at Montaigne, providing the camellias for Ventura from their magnificent collection, and that camellia which won the prize is among them. I wish I'd known that when my dear friend Mary Louise was alive. At Greenleaves, my cousin Melker Rock Beltsuber III still lovingly cares for the Greenleaves yard and the camellias of our ancestors. So today, the work of many generations can be seen in the mature plantings in the front and in the backyards. You can easily see the changes, especially in the views of the central axis. And now you can barely see the house for the camellia bushes or the back of the yard from the gallery. Just take a minute to compare the 1866 photograph of the front yard to the present one and look at the size of that oak tree. There's also a magnolia tree that is on the right-hand edge of the photograph that's the second largest in Mississippi according to the Forestry Service. In Natchez, there are also large documented collections of camellias all over town, as well as specimen camellias in yards and public spaces, including our beautiful cemetery. The recording and preservation of our town's camellia heritage has been the focus of some special people over the last few decades, and you all may know Susan Haltom and Glenn Haltom. My camellia journey has led to a new understanding of my family, since my grandfather actually died the year before I was born. None of his grandchildren know him, but we all have a knowledge of him because of the beautiful landscape he, along with our grandmother, Ruth Audley Beltsuber, left us. I know you're a Rose Society, but I'd also like you to continue to plant camellias in your gardens and public spaces. And in the process, you may also be creating a camellia legacy for your family, just as our grandparents, the Kuntzes and Melker and Ruth Audley Beltsuber, created a camellia legacy for our family, which continues today with the 7th generation of our family to benefit from the rich horticultural history of Natchez and to enjoy the camellias at Greenleaves, including New Year's weekend, when our son was married, when our grandchildren enjoyed making flower soup in that same bird bath with their ancestors' camellias. And thank you all for listening.